Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we examine a crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is January 27th. On this day in 1996, the tranquil streets of Claremont, an affluent suburb of Perth, Western Australia, were forever changed when 18-year-old Sarah Spiers vanished. Sarah's disappearance was the beginning of what would become one of Australia's most infamous cases, the Claremont serial killings. Over the next 15 months, two more young women, Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon, vanished, their tragic fates igniting fear and heartbreak throughout the community. These events led to one of the most extensive investigations in Australian history, spanning more than 2 decades before conviction finally brought some semblance of justice. Today, we'll explore the timeline of these events, remember the lives lost, and examine the long and arduous journey to justice. Let's get started. Claremont, nestled in Perth, was a lively, safe suburb known for its nightlife, popular cafes, and an atmosphere of security. By the mid-90s, it was the go-to spot for young people looking for a night out, with venues like the Continental Hotel standing out as a local favorite. And taxis were always on hand to ensure a safe trip home. But on January 27th, 1996, that all changed. That sense of safety was shattered when Sarah Spiers vanished after a night out. It was unthinkable. This was the kind of place where people felt protected. Sarah's disappearance left the community shaken, but no one could have predicted that it was only the beginning of something far more sinister. Over the next year, more women would go missing, and residents began to question their safety. Fear rippled across Perth as the realization sank in. A predator was stalking Claremont. The Claremont serial killings dominated the headlines, not just in Perth, but all across the country. For years, investigators searched for answers while families endured unimaginable grief. It would take over 20 years before a breakthrough finally brought this case to trial. So let's talk about the timeline. First was the disappearance of Sarah Spiers. Sarah Spiers, 18, was celebrating Australia Day with friends in Claremont on January 26, 1996. Sarah is described as a bright, kind woman with her whole life ahead of her. She was the youngest of 6 siblings and had just started a new secretarial job, which she loved. That night, she decided to head home around 2 a.m. on January 27th, so she called a taxi from the phone booth on Sterling Road. The taxi arrived minutes later, but Sarah was gone. She had vanished without a trace. Her family reported her missing later that day, and the search for Sarah began. Despite an extensive investigation, there was no evidence, no witnesses, and no sign of what happened to her. Sarah's body, to this day, has never been found, but police are certain that she was abducted and murdered that night. The second case is the disappearance of Jane Rimmer from June 9th, 1996. This was only 5 months after Sarah's disappearance, and tragedy struck again. Jane Rimmer, a 23-year-old child care worker, was out with friends at the Continental Hotel on June 8, 1996. Jane was known for her warmth and love of life. She was last seen on surveillance footage outside the hotel around midnight, chatting with other people who had been at the club. But when her friends went home, Jane was left alone, and she never made it back to her own home. On August 3rd, 1996, 2 months after her disappearance, Jane's body was found in bushland near Wellard, about 40 kilometers south of Perth. The discovery confirmed that her death was a homicide, though investigators withheld the cause of death as part of their ongoing investigation. The third case was the disappearance of Ciara Glennon on March 15th, 1997. 27-year-old Ciara Glennon was a lawyer with a fearless and adventurous spirit. On March 14th, 1997, Ciara went out with friends in Claremont. Around midnight, she left the Continental Hotel and was last seen walking along Sterling Highway, heading toward her home in Mosman Park. 3 weeks later, on April 3rd, 1997, Ciara's body was discovered in bushland near Eddington, about 40 kilometers north of Perth. Forensic evidence at the scene indicated a violent struggle. Her efforts to fight back against her attacker would later prove crucial in solving the case. The Claremont serial killing sparked one of Australia's most extensive investigations, known as Operation Marco. With 3 young women missing and 2 confirmed murdered, police faced mounting pressure to find answers. Police initially focused on taxi drivers, given that both Sarah and Jane were believed to have been seeking rides home. Hundreds of drivers were interviewed and their vehicles inspected, but no solid leads emerged. Lance Williams, a local man who often drove around Claremont late at night, became a person of interest. Despite heavy surveillance, no evidence ever linked him to the crimes, and he was eventually cleared. As months turned into years, the case went cold, leaving investigators frustrated and families desperate for answers. But years later, advances in forensic science gave police a new lead. DNA evidence collected from Ciara Glennon's body was re-examined, and by the 2000s, investigators had a profile, but they had no match in their database. The breakthrough in this case finally came in 2016 when police linked the DNA to Bradley Robert Edwards, a 48-year-old former Telstra technician. Fibers from Edwards' work uniforms were also linked to the crime scenes, tying him to the murders of Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon. In December 2016, police arrested Bradley Robert Edwards, who was described by people who knew him as a quiet and unassuming man. However, investigators uncovered a history of violent behavior. Edwards had previously been convicted of a 1988 attack on a woman in her home and a 1995 assault on a teenager in Karrakatta Cemetery. During his trial, which began in 2019, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including DNA from Ciara Glennon's body and those fibers linking Edwards to both Jane and Ciara's murders. Unfortunately, there was no direct evidence to tie him to Sarah Spiers' disappearance, though investigators strongly suspect that he was responsible for that as well. In September 2020, Edwards was convicted of the murders of Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. For Sarah Spiers' family, however, the lack of answers about her fate remains a lasting pain. Sarah, Jane, and Ciara were more than victims of a horrific crime. They were beloved daughters, sisters, and friends, and their memories continue to inspire efforts to create safer communities and honor their lives. The Claremont serial killings not only devastated the families of the victims, but also deeply affected the community and reshaped policing in Australia. The case highlighted the critical role of forensic technology in solving crimes and underscored the importance of perseverance in the face of long and challenging investigations. Today, the tragedy serves as a reminder of the resilience of those who never gave up, both the investigators who cracked the case decades later and the families who fought to keep their loved ones' memories alive. The Claremont serial killings remain one of Australia's most haunting cases. While Bradley Edwards' conviction brought some answers, the question of what happened to Sarah Spiers continues to weigh heavily not only on her family, but on the entire community. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. And be sure to join me tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day, True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!